Walk into a game store today. Go find one. There are still a few left. Notice the lights first. They're not off. They're just dimmer than you remember. Like the building itself is running on low power. The aisles are wider than they used to be. But wider doesn't mean fuller. It means emptier. There's more floor between you and the products aren't filling it. Near the entrance, there's a clothing rack. It says Style Essentials. You've never heard of Style Essentials? Nobody asked for Style Essentials, but it's there, taking up space that used to hold something you actually came to buy. Walk further in. The electronics are still around. Televisions, laptops, phone accessories, but the section feels like it's shrinking every time you visit. And somewhere near the back, where the food section used to live, there's just reorganized space. Shelves that have been moved. Categories that got quietly retired. This is what 55 years of brand equity looks like when it's being unwound from the inside. Game stores didn't collapse because of load shedding. It didn't lose because South Africans stopped spending money. It didn't even lose because of the internet, at least not primarily. The real story is stranger and more specific than any of those explanations. Game was bought by the richest retail company in the history of the world, a company worth over $400 billion, a company that operates more than 10,000 stores across 20-odd countries. And that company, and with all of that money, all of that infrastructure, all of that global supply chain muscle, couldn't figure out how to sell groceries in Durban. This is the autopsy, and the cause of death isn't what you think. Before we get any further into this investigation, we need to address the elephant in the room. The name's Junior, and I'm the new voice behind the autopsy. We read the comments, every single one of them. And look, you weren't subtle. We heard you. Now here's the part where I keep it completely honest with you. A solid half of the people typing the loudest complaints haven't been anywhere near that membership button. Not once. Haven't touched it. Don't even know what it looks like, but that's fine. We're built different. So here's what actually matters right now. You tell us in the comments whether this is the frequency you've been looking for. If I'm the guy, say so. If I need to pack up the mic and go home, say that too. We can handle it. This channel does autopsies for a living. We're not afraid of a bad diagnosis. Now, let's get back to work. Game was founded in 1970 in Durban. The name wasn't random. The concept behind it was that shopping should feel like a game, a hunt, a search for value, a small competitive thrill in finding something good at a price that made sense. General merchandise, broad range, designed to feel like a discovery rather than a transaction. Over the following decades, the pink identity became one of the most recognizable visual signals in South African retail. That specific shade of pink, loud enough to find from the other end of a mall corridor, became shorthand for a particular kind of shopping experience. You could get appliances there, you could get electronics, toys, clothing basics, food, sporting goods. It wasn't the cheapest store and it wasn't the most premium store. It lived in the broad, well-populated middle of the market, which is exactly where you want to be if you're building a mass retail brand. By the time Massmart absorbed Game into its portfolio, Massmart also owned Macro, Builders Warehouse, and several other chains. The brand had real weight behind it, real familiarity, real loyalty from customers who'd been shopping there across multiple decades and multiple life stages. That kind of equity doesn't appear on a balance sheet, but it's one of the most valuable things a retail brand can have. And then, in 2011, someone in Arkansas decided to buy it. Walmart's acquisition of a 51% controlling stake in Massmart for 16.5 billion rand, roughly $2.4 billion at the exchange rate of the time, was the largest foreign direct investment in South African retail history. The logic was straightforward, at least from Walmart's perspective. Africa was growing. South Africa was the most developed economy on the continent. Massmart had infrastructure, a property footprint, supplier relationships, and brand recognition across multiple retail categories. It was, in Walmart's framing, a springboard, not just into South Africa, but into the broader African continent.
What fascinates me right now about Walmart International is Africa. How should we read your acquisition of Massmart? What does that tell us about how ambitious your goals are on the continent?
Well, South Africa as a country presents a great opportunity. So first and foremost, that's where we've invested and that's where the majority of the revenue is, 92, 93% of the total revenue. Beyond that, into the region, you're right. We're thinking about it a city at a time, as Massmart has historically done, because that's where the population centers are, and there's enough business there to support a few stores so that we can learn the market.
The deal faced resistance. South African trade unions opposed it loudly, arguing it would lead to job losses and an influx of cheap imported goods that would undercut local suppliers. The Competition Tribunal approved the acquisition but attached conditions. Walmart had to maintain certain employment levels and commit to local sourcing targets. Those conditions were contested, negotiated, and ultimately watched over by regulators for years. But the conditions that got scrutinized publicly weren't the ones that would ultimately matter most. The conditions nobody was attaching to a legal document were the cultural and operational ones. Nobody was requiring Walmart to understand the South African consumer before redesigning the business around an American template. And that's exactly what they tried to do.
Black Friday frenzy is set to begin this week, and retailer Game is usually among the busiest stores during this time of the year. Now, we've seen endless queues starting in the early hours of the morning, but given consumers' financial constraints, what are the retailers' expectations this year?
For South Africa, the one-day Black Friday event is back.
Yeah.
And we've seen, given the hiatus over the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, the one day is actually what South Africans want.
Right.
Walmart's entire global operation runs on standardization. The same systems, the same procurement processes, the same inventory management logic, the same data infrastructure replicated across every market they enter, because scale and consistency are the foundation of how they generate margin. When it works extraordinarily well. Walmart became the largest company in the world by perfecting that model in markets where the underlying infrastructure was compatible with it. South Africa's infrastructure is not fully compatible with it. The road network, the logistics providers, the cold chain capacity, the supplier base, the load shedding reality, all of it introduces friction that Walmart's systems weren't originally built to accommodate. When Walmart started integrating its global technology infrastructure into Massmart's back-end operations, the result wasn't a smooth upgrade. It was a prolonged period of operational disruption that hit the actual stores in ways that customers could see and feel. Game stores in Randburg, in Durban, across the network started experiencing stock inconsistencies. Not dramatic empty shelf crises, but the grinding kind. Products that the system said were in stock but weren't on the floor. Reorder cycles that didn't match local demand patterns. Supply timing that worked for a distribution center in Texas but missed the specific rhythms of how South African suppliers operated. Staff couldn't always explain to customers why a particular product wasn't available. The real answer was usually somewhere in a procurement system that had been designed for a completely different retail environment. Here's why that matters. In retail, stock reliability is trust. When a customer makes a trip specifically for a product and leaves empty-handed, they don't necessarily come back. They adapt. They find a different store that tends to have what they're looking for, and they make that adjustment quietly, without fanfare, without any moment that shows up in a customer satisfaction survey. The store just slowly loses a shopper. It doesn't know it's lost. While the back end was struggling, Game was also experimenting with its product mix in ways that compounded the confusion. In 2011 and 12, the company began rolling out Game Fresh, a fresh food offering that was meant to drive footfall and increase basket size by adding the retail category that brings consumers back most consistently. Food, specifically fresh food, meat, produce, the kind of grocery shopping that South African households do every week. The idea made sense on a spreadsheet. Fresh food is a high-frequency purchase. If you can get customers coming to Game for their weekly groceries, you increase visit frequency across the whole store and give yourself more opportunities to sell the higher-margin merchandise. Walmart's US stores operate this way. The grocery section is often the engine that drives traffic for everything else. But Game Fresh failed, and it failed for a reason that no spreadsheet could have predicted, because the reason was psychological. South Africans have deeply ingrained habits about where they buy fresh food. Those habits are built around trust. Trust in the freshness of the product, trust in the cold chain, trust in the brand's identity as a food retailer. Game's brand had been built over 40 plus years around electronics, appliances, general merchandise, and toys. That equity didn't transfer to fresh meat. It felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to act on. Consumers just didn't want to buy their chicken from the same place they bought their television. Game Fresh was quietly wound down by 2020. 9 years of investment, 9 years of floor space and refrigeration infrastructure and supplier contracts, and the outcome was a retreat back to the original product mix, minus the capital that had been spent on the experiment and minus the years of opportunity cost.
At 12 o'clock Friday morning, customers were seen already queuing outside retail store Game for Black Friday. While this may be the case, some customers left empty-handed.
By 2019, Massmart's financial position had become very difficult to defend. The group reported a loss of 1.4 billion rand for that financial year. 1.4 billion rand. For a company that had spent decades as a profitable pillar of South African retail, that number represented something structural, not cyclical. COVID arrived the following year and made everything worse, accelerating trends that were already moving in the wrong direction. More online shopping, less foot traffic, less discretionary spending in the physical retail environment. Walmart spent those years watching the numbers deteriorate and making incremental decisions that didn't add up to a turnaround. And then, in late 2022, they made the move that told you everything about how they'd concluded this would go. Walmart bought out the remaining 47% of Massmart that they didn't already own for 6.4 billion rand. They then delisted Massmart from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange entirely. Let's sit with that for a moment, because that second part matters more than the first. Delisting from a stock exchange means a company is no longer required to publish its financial results publicly. It no longer has to file quarterly reports or annual statements that any investor or journalist or competitor can read. The numbers stop being public. The performance becomes invisible to everyone outside the boardroom. Walmart spent 6.4 billion rand to take full control of a business that had just posted a 1.4 billion rand loss in a single year, and then they removed it from public view. You don't do that because you're about to announce a dramatic comeback strategy you want the world to watch. You do it because the decisions that follow are ones you'd rather make without an audience. Those decisions became visible in November 2025. Walmart started physically replacing Game-branded stores with Walmart-branded stores. Not quietly, not gradually. The signage came down and new signage went up. Clearwater Mall in Rudaport, Four Ways Mall in Johannesburg. The pink that had been on those buildings for years, in some cases for decades, was replaced with Walmart's corporate blue. Think about what that actually means. Walmart paid $2.4 billion in 2011 to enter the South African market through a brand that South Africans already loved and trusted. They spent over a decade integrating it, restructuring it, experimenting with its product mix, and absorbing its losses. And the conclusion they arrived at after all of that was that the right move was to retire the local brand entirely and replace it with their own name. The brand that South Africans never built a relationship with. The brand that most South African consumers associate with an American company they've seen in documentaries but never shopped in. The brand that carries no nostalgia, no Saturday morning memories, no 55 years of familiarity. There's a business logic to it. Walmart wants global brand consistency, wants to leverage its international supplier relationships directly, wants to operate its stores under a single identity that connects to its global infrastructure. That logic is internally coherent, but it ignores something that retail can't actually afford to ignore, which is that customers don't walk into stores because of supply chain coherence. They walk in because of familiarity, trust, and habit, and those things are attached to the name on the door. Here's the version of this story that's hardest to square. Walmart is worth over $400 billion. It operates in 20 plus countries. It employs over 2 million people. Its logistics and supply chain operation is legitimately one of the most sophisticated in human history, and it couldn't fix game supply chain problems in Durban. That's not rhetorical, it's an actual operational reality. For years after the acquisition, game stores in major South African cities experienced the kind of stock inconsistencies that a company with Walmart's resources should have been able to solve quickly. The reason they couldn't solve them quickly is that their solutions were designed for markets with different infrastructure, different supplier ecosystems, and different logistics realities. Being the biggest retail company in the world means you're very good at operating in markets that resemble your home market. South Africa doesn't fully resemble that market. This is the core of the autopsy finding. Game didn't die because South Africans stopped wanting to shop. It didn't die because the products it sold became irrelevant. It didn't even die because it failed to adapt to online retail, though that's a contributing factor. It died, or at least it's dying in its current form, because the company that bought it treated it as a vehicle rather than a brand. A vehicle for market entry, a vehicle for African expansion, a vehicle for operational standardization, not a business with its own identity and its own relationship with its own customers. The 55% market share that Game and its Massmart siblings hold across various retail categories is real, but market share is only meaningful relative to the health of the market you're sharing, and in several of Game's core categories, the market has shifted significantly. Electronics retail has fragmented. There's incredible connection. There's online purchasing from Takealot. There's grey market importing. There's the second-hand marketplace. General merchandise has fragmented similarly. The middle market retail space the Game occupied so comfortably for 50 years is now being contested from multiple directions simultaneously. Holding a percentage of a shrinking and fragmenting market doesn't protect you the way holding the same percentage of a stable growing market does. It just means you're losing more slowly than some of your competitors. The Walmart branded stores replacing Game in Clearwater and Fourways aren't inherently worse than what was there before. They carry products, they employ people, they serve customers, but they don't carry 55 years of emotional context. They don't trigger the specific kind of recognition that a familiar brand triggers in a consumer who grew up with it. They're new, and new is not what you want to be in a market where your competitor already has legacy. Game isn't fully gone, not yet. There are still stores operating under the Game name, still staff employed, still products being sold, but the direction is visible, and it's been visible for a while. The closures, the rebranding, the delisting from public view, the replacement signage going up in major malls, these aren't the signs of a company preparing a comeback. They're the signs of a company being absorbed into something else. The optimists will say that Walmart's resources and global infrastructure will eventually produce a more efficient, more competitive retail operation in these spaces than Game was managing on its own. Maybe it's possible if Walmart can adapt its systems to South African operational realities in a way it hasn't managed in the 15 years since the acquisition, and if South African consumers extend the same goodwill to the Walmart brand that they gave to Game for half a century, then the stores that replace Game might build their own version of what Game had. But you can't erase 55 years of brand equity and just expect customers to follow the products to whatever name goes on the door next. Retail loyalty is specific. It attaches to names, to visual identities, to the particular feeling of a particular store you've been going to since you were a child. When you retire the name, you're telling those customers to start over. And starting over with customers who didn't ask to start over is one of the hardest things a retail brand can ask of itself. Game got built over 55 years by people who were building something for South African customers. It got bought by people who were building something for a global spreadsheet. Those two things were never fully compatible, and the store you walk into today, dimmer, emptier, with a clothing rack near the door selling a brand you've never heard of, is what happens when the spreadsheet wins. Game over.